Okay, this is a presentation about Alexender Pope and Twickenham, and you may not know that he came here in 1719, so we're going back in time 300 years, and he was famous before he came here, mainly because he'd made a lot of money translating Homer's Iliad and then publishing it in a weekly publication, rather like Dickens did later. He made a lot of money, and some of Dickens' stories, if you remember, went on and on and on so that he could make more money, I think. But also he was a very fluent writer. So let's have a look at Twickenham 300 years ago. This is from about the 1850s when Horace Walpole was here.
This is.
And the colour doesn't show up too well on here, but I can show you that Alexender Pope lived in this villa overlooking the river, very small garden, and he had this 5-acre garden backing onto Radnor Road. Strawberry Hill, where Horace Walpole lived after Pope. And then there was a lady called Lady Mary Wortley Montague, who lived here, which is, I can show you better on this map. There's a map here, which is best if it's up right way up, which shows that Lady Mary Montague lived next to SOUL. SOUL is the green circle. And that's Beaumont House now. So her house is long gone. But their gardens were very close to each other because Pope rather liked Lady Mary Wortley Montague, and he encouraged her to come next to SOUL, although SOUL was 300 years too late, really. Another lady we're going to be looking at is Henrietta Howard, who set up Marble Hill House, which is just off this map. So in the early 18th century, there was no Chertsey Road, no railway, but of course we had the river, and most of the properties were around Church Street and King Street, and some going up Cole Park Road. But after Pope, who was well known, more people came into Twickenham, particularly along the riverside. But we have to say that the key figures were all quite upper class, shall we say, so it was easier for them to come and build a big house than you and I could. So although it had was a riverside village, it did become a retreat for London's wealthy and artistic elite. This is a painting by Tillemans, which is in Orleans Gallery, and that shows Pope's villa in about 1725. This is Radnor Gardens, Radnor House. This is the Bath House, which has been moved up here more, but there still is a 18th century Bath House in Radnor Gardens. If you're not too clear on the geography, this is central Twickenham. That's St Mary's Church. There's another house here, Cross Deep it's called, which I think is up for sale at the moment. Well, last time it was on the market, I think it was about 7 million, wasn't it? So I don't know what Pope's villa would be up for now, but it was destroyed in the 19th century. The other interesting thing about this painting, it's a great panorama, and it shows that the Ham side of the river was quite busy, whereas today it's very overgrown. So it was a working river. You can just see trees above Pope's villa, which would have been in his garden. And the grotto is that black oblong in the basement. So he made a grotto in the basement. So it's just a couple of pictures. Does anyone know where that is? It's Radnor Gardens, yes. So this is a fairly rare photograph because it's got the war memorial, which was erected in probably the 1920s, and it's also got Radnor House, which was destroyed by a bomb in 1940. So Radnor House, I just put that in because that was a massive property next to Pope's. And we can also see Pope's villa as it was, whereas that's a modern picture of Marble Hill. And what architecture do you prefer of these two Palladian style villas? I know what I prefer, and that's the one that's still standing, Marble Hill, because it's rather palatial and symmetrical, whereas Pope's villa, rather uneven roof, and he also had this portico which didn't quite work, but it was still an imposing building of a Palladian style which was very fashionable. And this is a more modern picture of the grotto, which is in here. So if you go to the grotto today, the bit that you see is here, and then there's schools and other buildings all around it. So it's all very quirky. So a bit about Alexender Pope. So by the time he came to Twickenham, he was 31. He was obviously a leading poet, very clever couplets he wrote, such as "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread." That wasn't Shakespeare, it was Pope. But from early on, he had tuberculosis of the spine, or it's also called Pott's disease. So he had a bent spine, which I think was quite uncomfortable at times. And he was 4'6" tall, which is, so he didn't like pictures of him standing up. So another of his sayings was, "To err is human, to forgive is divine." That's a great saying, but I don't think Alexender Pope lived up to that either. And when Pope wrote a criticism of man, he sort of identified a lot of weaknesses in human nature. But he was able to give these wonderful phrases, but do people follow them? So let's look at the grotto. So as his main garden was going to be on the other side of the road from the river, he decided to extend the basement under the road to reach his garden. And at the same time, he thought he'd decorate the basement by using stucco and erecting minerals, quartz, shells, even mirrors, in often a random fashion. And the whole thing can be seen today, although the actual objects which are in the grotto have changed over the years as people have stolen some and others have been replaced. So it's an artificial cave lined with crystals, shells and minerals. And it was inspired by classical and mythological themes. Actually, Saba wrote this bit. I don't know where you got that from, Saba. It's survived, as we say, it's beneath a school and the road. So this is, there's two side chambers and a main chamber, which then leads into a tunnel. This is the south chamber, which has got a brick floor, which is medieval, and an unknown statue. And we also, the odd thing is this plinth is a Gothic design, and a strong theory is that comes from Strawberry Hill House, the Gothic building, which when the owners later were running short of money, they had to get rid of or sell on a lot of their items. So it is possible that's from Strawberry Hill House. Then last year we did a lot of work on the floor to make it more stable, and in doing so, one of the students doing the work found something I've got in my pocket. Maybe not surprising, but these bits of broken glass are from medieval drinking vessels with a rounded, curved lip. So they were under the floor, and so it's very likely they've been there for more than 300 years, or maybe they were there in Pope's time. So this, when you go to the grotto, there's lots of weird things like this. It takes a bit of time to work out what on earth they are. So even if they weren't alcoholics, anyone living there would have stored their wine and drink in the basement in the grotto where it was cooler. But it was also probably a good place to have a little bit of a party. So moving on the grotto, now this is another bit that Saba wrote. Where did you get this from, Saba? Did you make this up? Is this grotto or gossip?
It's online.
Huh? It's online. In the grotto, do you think there's oyster shells, a fake sunlight machine, crystals from Cornwall, fossilised dragon skull, or basalt stones from the Giant's Causeway in Ireland? And they're all there apart from the fossilised dragon skull. It isn't there. But certainly a lot of crystals and stones from Cornwall. And because in those days the front of the grotto was exposed to the morning sun, it was actually quite bright. So there was talk that Pope erected a hole in the door which acted a bit like a camera obscura effect. So the light then shone onto some of his shiny stones in an interesting way. And we do know that these came from basalt from the Giant's Causeway because there were letters exchanged with Sir Hans Sloane, who donated them. The other thing that Pope did was he rejected traditional gardening and made it a little bit more interesting and random. So, and he created a natural landscape. He also advised on the gardening at Marble Hill House. And this, do you know where this is? There's a clue in the building. This is the garden today at Marble Hill, where they have spent a lot of money to recreate it in the style of the 18th century. And Pope advised on the design. So in terms of written work, we've identified that Pope did actually do quite a lot of writing here. The Dunciad, an essay on man, where a lot of his catchy sayings came from, like, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. Hope springs eternal in the human breast." That's what, some of these are quite positive thoughts. So that's a kind of introduction based on Pope, but we're going to be looking at some of the creative people in Twickenham in that time, beginning with Godfrey Kneller, who was here before Pope, and he was up by the rugby ground, although wasn't there at the time. I shall be focusing on Alexander Pope's girlfriends, Lady Mary Montague and Henrietta Howard. who were quite very creative people. Although they were upper class, they had a lot of adversity in their life, but shone through. A quick mention of Thomas Twining, because he was in Twickenham in the 1720s, but I'm not sure that Pope knew him because he was a businessman, of course. Horace Walpole and J.M.W. Turner came later, but they had some thoughts about this time. So just a bit about Sir Godfrey Kneller. He was born in Germany but became British, and he was a famous court painter to both Charles II and George I. He also painted Louis XIV, Isaac Newton, and so on. When he came to, you know, Kneller Hall up just round by the rugby ground, there were some small houses there, but he bought a whole stretch of land and built Kneller Hall. I don't think it's the same as it is today, though, I'm told. And I'm wondering whether the stretch of land he had actually stretched down to Kneller Gardens by Crane River. Some people are nodding, I think. After he died, it was turned into a farm, so it would have been quite a big area. He painted out two of our star characters 3 times. Now, I discovered Horace Walpole quite liked criticising people, so the fact that he's criticised someone is not unusual. I looked up the word lucre, which I think largely means money. So where he offered 1 picture to fame, he sacrificed 20 to lucre. That's Walpole, but Walpole was a very clever writer. So Henrietta Howard, I've got some notes here. The important thing about her life was that she lost her parents by the time she was 12. Her father died in a duel, would you believe? She also had the misfortune of her husband, Charles Howard, who was the Earl of Suffolk, being a compulsive gambler, a drunkard, and always running out of money. Not a very good choice. She was pretty good at choosing people, but she made a mistake there. She also had the unusual position of having a responsibility in the court of Queen Caroline in the 1720s, and was also at the same time mistress of her husband, King George II. But being mistress of the king was not a secret, it was a position that you held, and it gave her quite a bit of money. So when she got the money, she didn't tell her husband because William Hill would have got it, or the equivalent in those days. Yeah, so she was a witty writer and poet, and designed and built and furnished Marble Hill House. And before he became George II, she actually visited Hanover to meet Prince George, and obviously made a big impression with him, and got this position in the court. And then she regularly hosted cultural gatherings at Marble Hill with poets such as Jonathan Swift and John Gay. Now, Jonathan Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels. John Gay, do we know he wrote The Merry Widow or something? I'm not an expert on that. But at this time, they produced some sort of bestsellers. So the Palladian villa that we love today was actually built in secret from her husband, using the money from George II. And because she knew Pope, Charles Bridgman and Pope advised on the design of the landscape garden, which she did follow. But she had some pretty good taste, and some of the choices must have been hers. So she didn't live there much of the time while it was being built, but Alexender Pope seemed to go there a lot with his friends. And there's an ice house that's still there today. And Swift said, we soon ran out of the contents in the ice house. So later in life, she found working in the court was quite hard and long hours, and she was able to actually establish her own sophisticated cultural centre and attract interesting people and survive financially. And this meant that she then left the court. And she kept in touch with Pope throughout most of this time. Now, I put this up because this is a painting which is still hanging in Marble Hill House, and it was commissioned by, or the book I read said commissioned or bought by Henrietta Howard. There's a bit of a difference. And this is by Giovanni Panini, the Italian painter. Statues in a ruined arch. And I remember when I was deputy mayor in, this is going back a long way, 1985, I was lucky enough to be invited to Marble Hill House, because the house in 1985 belonged to the GLC, and they had arts funding, and they'd been able to reacquire some of Panini's paintings. And so I was delighted to go and observe what they had achieved. A year later, the GLC was disbanded, sadly. I Googled Panini at Marble Hill House, and it came up with Marble Hill Cafe. But I did manage to find this. I find his work really striking. So a bit about their relationship, because I think Alexander was very fond of Henrietta, and he was a frequent visitor. However, later in life, Henrietta managed to get rid of Charles and remarried and had a much more successful marriage. But in doing so, she had to lose access to her son. And we understand Alexender Pope was rather put out that she'd chosen another man. And in fact, it was she had a lot of positive comments about her in writing. And Pope wrote, "Has she no faults then?" Envy says. "Sir, yes, she has one, I must aver. When all the world conspires to praise her, the woman's deaf and does not hear," which is true. And she used a trumpet earpiece to listen to people from the late 1720s. I don't know whether this is a nasty thought, but I just wondered if her husband was so violent that had anything to do with her losing her hearing. But then one of those poet friends of Pope also had a hearing disability. It's surprising how many people had a disability. Oops. So this is the only known picture of Savile House, which is just 50 yards down the road. Although it was used by Mary Montagu, it was destroyed in 1912 to make way for Savile Road. There's a lovely car there. So Pope wrote a poem to his fellow poet John Gay describing his sadness when Mary Wortley Montagu wasn't there. It's quite dramatic. Joy lives not here, to happier seats it flies, and only dwell where Wortley casts her eyes. And he then went on, hello. Sorry. So Alexander went on to say, a deer has struck, I feel like a deer struck by an arrow, bleeding to death drop by drop. Now, an analysis of this is, at one level, this was a literary joke between friends, but at another, it expressed Pope's true feelings. And indeed, for a year or so, Mary and Pope would meet often, reading poetry together. And Pope commissioned Godfrey Kneller to paint a portrait of Mary Montagu. So this, do you recognise this? This is Radnor Road. I put this in actually because it does actually look like the back of Pope's garden, except in his time there would have been bushes, but there would have been tall trees, and it would have been separated off. So when Pope came to say Mary Montagu, he came under the road through his grotto, walked down his garden, through here, and the back of Mary Montagu's house was only about 200 yards from here. Yes, so you can demonstrate that. This is a photograph of the end of the tunnel linked to the grotto. So 300 years ago, the steps up to his garden would have looked a bit like that, but that's obviously modern, and it's still there. And so he'd come out of his garden and just walk down here and be able to surreptitiously meet up with Mary. And I even wondered whether part of his motivation for building the tunnel under the road was because it was at a time when he was almost infatuated with her. But it was a motivation for him to build a tunnel under the road, make it easier to get down here. And indeed, it was Pope and Kneller who persuaded Mary Montagu and her husband to live here. But we shall never know exactly. So if we have a look at 1725, exactly 300 years ago, what was happening? Well, Pope has finished his grotto, and in that year he publishes his version of Homer's Odyssey. He'd had a nurse since childbirth looking after him called Mary Beach, and so that was for 37 years, and she died, and you can see this plaque today to Mary Beach on St Mary's Church in Twickenham, and it's strangely written because it actually says Alex Pope in big letters, but they didn't fill his name in completely. Very weird, but it's rather stylish. And at this time, Henrietta Howard has started that long period of building the Marble Hill House. Thomas Twiningers moved next door to the church, but almost next to this plaque, and the dial on Dial House where he lived is dated 1726. Mary Montagu is focusing on bringing up her children, and Pope and Mary Montagu are beginning to fall out. We're going to look at that. What went wrong? Oh, what went wrong was a good title. Okay, I was going to read a bit from, David gave me this book about Mary Montagu, and there's a bit which tries to analyse why they fell out. There were several reasons. I won't read them all. Another story which was put about by Robert Walpole's son Horace, so he loves things that are going wrong, was that Mary borrowed a pair of bed sheets from Pope and returned them to him unlaundered. Now, I'm not sure if that's the reason why they should fall out. This was the cause of their quarrel, he explained. And Horace later fixated on Mary being filthy and unkempt, having been influenced by what Pope would go on to write about. Pope never forgave her for falling out with him, and their exchanges in poetry, which they published, got more and more vicious. Another possible explanation concerns Pope's old nurse, who died in 1725, and this memorial we just saw. And there was an anonymous poem, which we're pretty sure was written by Mary Montagu. No wonder that he's so stout and so strong, since he lugged and he tugged at the bubby so long. I think it's suggesting that he still looked on her as though he is a baby. It was said that Mary had written these cruel lines. They certainly would have offended Pope. Another reason may centre on two portraits which Pope commissioned. In 1720, he asked Kneller, as I say, to paint Lady Mary, but he also got Henrietta Howard painted at the same time. So Mary might have been upset by that. But the most widely accepted explanation is the one told by Mary Montagu's granddaughter, Lady Louisa, sometime later. They always believed this was the reason why her grandmother fell out with Pope. Apparently, at a moment when Mary was totally unprepared for it, Pope approached her and made a declaration. He was so ardent in his protestations of love, she found it impossible to be serious or even to be angry. Instead, she burst into gales of laughter. I don't think he would have liked that. Excuse me. And I've actually, this is relatively well known, but I hadn't seen it before. Much later, that incident, which was very well known because the two were quite popular in the literary world, there was a painting by William Frith showing just her reaction and Pope's dismay. And because his type's short, he's sitting down. I mean, so that could be the answer, but we'll never know. And also just a bit more about their disagreements. Yeah, Mary Montagu was not impressed with Pope's grotto. As you can see, she felt that it was basically cold and smelly with cheap things in it. And Pope responded with published poetry implicating that Mary was not clean, was diseased, and behaved like a prostitute. But where's that to forgive is divine gone, I wonder? And that's a rather stunning painting that Godfrey Kneller produced as commissioned by Pope. And it did remain in a prominent position in Pope's main room until he died, even though he was writing all those nasty things. The other thing about Mary Montagu, which I didn't mention, which is very important, was the work she did with smallpox. She did actually, unless I cover it next, no. Yeah, so I didn't cover this because she became, she traveled to Istanbul and discovered they were immunizing people with small bits of pus from smallpox, which was a deadly disease, cutting people's arms and putting a little bit of pus in, which usually worked as an immunization. And she even got Queen Caroline to do the same. And she did the same to her own daughter, who went on to marry the Prime Minister in about 1760. So she was a scientist and a poet. But she had an infatuation where she fell totally head over heels when this 24-year-old Italian writer came over here to meet her and Pope. So he came into Savile House just next door, and she completely fell for him. This was 1736, so he was 24. How old was she? She was 47, and also she'd actually had smallpox, so she'd actually got scars on her face. And even in that beautiful painting, Nella ignored the scars on her face. But she had a great personality, so that she did at least have a relationship with this Italian, and she went to Italy chasing him. But Francesco loved Lord Hervey, a male friend of Mary. This is much more spicy than the stuff you get today, isn't it? Pope mocked Hervey in a poem, you know, kind of saying no one knows whether he likes men or women. Up and down, in and out, who knows? But Lady Mary didn't seem to know that, that Algarotti preferred Lord Hervey. Oh, well, is this what happened in Twickenham? No, it didn't all happen in Twickenham. Yeah, so moving forward, what happened to Pope's Villa was that Lady Howe, who bought it, found too many people visiting, and she wanted to build something on the site. This was in 1808, where Turner was now living, and he was a fan of Pope and rather unhappy to see this. So he immediately painted the villa, and in a better copy of this you can actually see scaffolding. And in the Twickenham Museum at the moment they've got quite a good copy of this Turner painting, which sold for 200 guineas shortly after 1808, but it went for 5 million in about 2008. Don't know what it's worth now. Yeah, so where are we today? So do we know where these places are? You might recognise Nella Hall. Yes, Nella Hall is converting to a school. So only 2 weeks ago the planning permission was given to Radnor House, because this used to be the music school for the armed forces, and it's lain empty for about 10-15 years, hasn't it? So it's going to remain and will be called Nella Hall School, but it's not going to be ready till 2027. This is the site of St Mary's Church, where we've actually got Twining's memorial next to Mary Beach, Pope's nurse. Strawberry Hill House and Twickenham Museum. Strawberry Hill House is very much as it was externally, but there's not a lot related to Walpole inside. Twickenham Museum is in a small house which was owned by Thomas Twining. So we've got quite a few links with the 18th century. And Turner's house, there's a very good exhibition there this summer. But do we know where this is? No answers. Now that's Alexander Pope's garden. So this is taken from Radnor Road, looking through the gate. So, and in fact, the school did put in a planning application to do more building. It was refused because it's a historic site, but very few people realise. Weeping willow trees were brought in from North China, and Pope was one of the first to plant them. And here's a shot of the wonderful willow trees in Radnor Gardens during a flood. We've also got willow trees in Kneller Gardens, which I wonder if that's a coincidence or deliberate. Oops. Yeah, I mentioned Twickenham Museum, which is open at weekends. And then at Champions Wharf, just down the road, there is a memorial for Pope with some of his sayings on the bench. Who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel, and so on. So this is St Mary's is right next door to all of these places. Turner's House, Walpole's Strawberry Hill, very good cafe at Strawberry Hill. So do enjoy the history, and I'd certainly recommend a visit to Marble Hill House and the gardens now that it's been refurbished. Pope certainly was a coffee drinker because he had a bit of pain with his scoliosis. He could work longer hours drinking coffee, but he was a bit critical of politicians. Coffee, which makes the politician wise and see through all things with hard shut eyes. Not that they were falling asleep during question time. Saba wrote this bit at the bottom. So I don't know what upcoming events you've got. But you're hoping to do more on Pope on social media.
All I can is work is Smiles documents purpose at the university proposed
Sorry?
lecture in for group on the university proposed you do the history of rock and roll.
The history of?
Rock and roll.
History of rock and roll. It's the other place, which is 20th century history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is open at the weekend. Several days. I was there the other day. Yeah, it's worth a visit too. And Orleans House. I didn't touch on that. So, are there any questions?
Sorry, English. I know you related.
Yes. So, I know Tony Beckles-Wilson, who's responsible for getting the grotto reopened and improved, wanted me to be involved because of my name. But I haven't done the research, so it's unlikely, but we can't be certain.
I get the impression that he fell out, not because he invented that's because she rejects being so because she rejected his love, so he just so
Yes.
devastated by that.
Well, Pope had been successful and he was getting used to getting what he wanted. He was used to that, and when he couldn't get what he wanted, he must have been really unhappy.
Pope is Catholic.
He was Catholic, yes, which is partly why he moved out of Twickenham, then was outside London.
Yeah. Are you Catholic?
No.
No, it doesn't relate.
So the grotto that is what would be now what was St Paul's School rather than the river. I read the Gardens. So the
St James, wasn't it?
now being
It's now Radnor House.
the bay.
Hmm.
So was what St Catherine stands on his garden as well? Because
Yes.
it goes underneath, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
St.
St Catherine's.
For a long time, St Catherine's was on both sides of that road, and St Catherine's owning the grotto.
And then it shows St Paul's and
Yes.
Tears.
When St Catherine's opened at the beginning of the 20th century, and the garden of Pope's villa, they had all of that as well. And the nuns found it in a terrible state, and they had scythes and went out scything the long grass down.
I did used to use the tunnel as well.
Yeah, my daughter used the tunnel. And we had some visitors to the grotto a couple of years ago who'd been at St Catherine's during the Second World War and used the grotto as an air raid shelter. And but the nuns put books in the grotto, so they had to work during an air raid, which they remembered. Okay, well, thanks for listening.
So what are the cultural impact of Pope's era and the night of the swap in the society as it's now?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say, really. I always think Dickens had a much bigger... people like Jane Austen and Dickens made a big impact on social life. I think Pope was a bit more of a philosopher, and he was good at understanding why people behave in the way they do and expressing it in a witty way. And so, yeah, maybe he encouraged more wit in literature. But that may be a different thing to study.
We'll go in.
You ever say who breaks a butterfly in a wheel? It was quoted by Jacob Rees-Mogg, isn't it?
Oh, was it?
When Mick Jagger and Keith Richards was jailed for having drugs. He's 167, I said PO. Before you would have learned that one. Very fans say.
No, I mean, I was only interested in Pope because I lived very near the grotto. So I thought I'd better find out more about him. And there's quite a lot to it, as you can see.
I didn't really understand about it. Of course, I noticed he may basically go down. But what did it actually do you see? Because you mentioned the house, the beds of the house. Is that much?
So the grotto was the basement of his villa. And there was a house before he got there, much smaller. So we don't know, maybe the basement was always there. So it was a brick-built structure, and then he clad it with mortar and then stuccoed stones, minerals, fossils, all sorts of things.
It's not the same as a grotto. It's just been renovated with marble in the gardens.
No, that's very different. Yeah. So, I mean, they're completely different. Marble Hill has got this beautiful landscaped area leading down to the grotto, and the grotto has got nothing in it.
Oh, it's
Pope's grotto is a...
written there.
Yeah, I think it might have
Shouts of it.
been part of a small amphitheatre they were trying to build. Pope's grotto is really interesting inside, but the approach is a shambles, going down steps and bumping into easels from the art block next door. And it literally happens. Oops. Yeah, so this summer there are interesting places to visit. Okay, that's about it for Pope, I think.